you know, 4 years ago we talked about this, and about 4 years ago this week actually, in a similar forum, and you said that everybody knows the shape of a two-state solution. I mean, that actually you could write it down, and everybody outside could easily come to agreement, and yet the participants seem no closer to it. So, is it? You think the key is somehow getting them to see each other's point of view?
I think the key now is to try and create a viable, a credible negotiating process, and then back that with real change on the ground. You know, because the thing that I really learned since being there and traveling around the West Bank, occasionally into Gaza, seeing obviously the state of Israel, is that, you know, I don't know whether any people have actually ever been out to the region, but one of the things that's really important is, first of all, just to get out a map. And you see, you can fit the whole of Israel and the Palestinian territory into a bit of New York State. Right? So it's a small bit of territory. And basically, unless you find a way of calming the situation and then getting a dialogue going, then you can't resolve it very easily. And the problem right now, I think, is that there is a danger with everything else that is happening in the region. I think there is a danger that we, from the outside, keep thinking conventionally about this, whereas there has literally been a revolution in the region. So Egypt is not the same. Syria is not the same. In fact, Israel's two major allies in the region, Turkey and Egypt, both those relationships are completely altered. The Gulf countries are, you know, obviously also looking at how this affects their own interests, and then you've got the issue of Iran. So it's quite a confusing region. Yeah.
Well, I fully agree with the Prime Minister. Number one, there are the elements, the technical elements to have a solution. But more fundamentally, I think there is a question of whether people in Israel believe that the present state of affairs can be sustained forever. And my answer to this question is no. I mean, there is no way that you can go on like this forever. So there must be a solution. Now, it is not so much or only about getting the two parts in conflict right there to an agreement. I think this problem needs a much more holistic approach. There are some elements in the equation that have to be put in place. And just let me give you one or two examples. One of them is Iran. I don't see how we will have a solution if the relationship, interaction with Iran doesn't change. And I think you need that for two reasons. One, you don't want to have a nuclear weapon Iran, but you don't want to have something outrageous done to stop that. So the only way to go is through a diplomatic solution with Iran. Now, you are not going to have that if you have a more strategic, well-defined policy towards Iran, which fundamentally consists of engagement, something that this country has really neglected to do for 30 or more years. So I think if the government of the United States wanted to have one of the pieces there, they have to deal with Iran in a very fundamental, different way than the one that has been there today. That is one example. Well, there is also the question of the other Arab countries, and I think there is a new element which is terribly important. And I guess Dan Jeremy has been here spoken about that, and that is that the United States is going to be, for practical purposes, energy independent in a few years. And I think this can change fundamentally the way in which relationship with some of the Gulf countries can be conducted. And perhaps a third example, and these are just examples to illustrate even domestic politics in the United States. You know, I consider myself an admirer, friend of Israel. So many of my friends here are, you know, the Jewish persuasion. And 99% of those people are very enlightened, and they tell you, oh, we need to have a solution there. Everything that Tony would say, they would say. And yet, I don't know what happens, that the politics in this country towards what's going on there is controlled by somebody else, not that 99% of people I talk to in the community. So I guess that other element, if there is going to be leadership and a holistic view, has to be tackled. I think we have to be very transparent about domestic politics in the United States in dealing with the Middle East issues.
Iran, do you have a view of what the U.S. and role should be? Should we move closer to Europe's role?
Well, the problem that we have is that, I mean, as Ernesto just said, we're absolutely right. We don't want to nuclear arm Iran. The best way to stop it would be if a diplomatic solution works. The problem would be if it doesn't. The issue, I mean, let me try and put this. What I think, and I agree with what you were saying about it's a holistic solution. If I was looking at a whole strategy for the Middle East, it would comprise these elements. One, where there's been revolution, support those people that believe in democratic principles. In other words, support the people who don't just want one democratic election, one time, but want elections, you know, and realize that the true test of a democracy is not simply how the majority come to power, but how they treat the minority. Right. Support the democratic elements where there's been a revolution. Where there's not been a revolution, understand there will be unless there's evolution. So support evolution. So I personally think wherever you look at the region, there are unsustainable forms of government. You know, it's going to be very tricky diplomatically to talk about this because you're sometimes talking about close allies. The truth is there needs to be a process of evolution. We should be supporting that. Thirdly, we should push back on the power of Iran. I'll come back to that in a moment, because the problem with the Iranians is not simply the nuclear weapons issue, it's the fact that they are exporting instability, terrorism occasionally, but certainly, you know, a closed-minded view of the world all over the region. And the fourth is the Middle East peace process. I would add a fifth, actually, which is dealing with this issue of religion within the region and how we create platforms of understanding between faiths in order that those people within the region understand that there is a way in which you can have your own faith without disregarding someone who has a different faith. Okay? So I think what we need is a different approach that puts all of these elements together. The problem is, and this is always the problem in politics, that you know, there's a British Prime Minister who once asked, what is the most difficult thing about being Prime Minister? And he said, events, events. And what actually we have got with Iran is a situation where probably over the next year or so, if Iran continues to ramp up its capability and the diplomacy doesn't work, we're going to be faced with some pretty difficult decisions. And you know, the thing is there, you've got to deal with real politics. If Israel believes that Iran is literally going to cross that threshold, and we can argue about what the threshold is, but if it thinks it's going to cross it, for them they regard this as existential. So I think we've got one last chance to make diplomacy work. I think it's important, obviously, that it does. Sanctions, by the way, have a huge impact. I mean, Iraq is now exporting more oil than Iran for the first time in sort of many decades. The Iranian economy has suffered hugely as a result of this. So it's not as if the present policy is having no impact. It's just we're not actually at a point where you can say it's worked. So we're in a very delicate time here. And I do believe ultimately, if there was a proper form of democracy in Iran, that would make the 100% more optimistic about the whole of the region overnight.
So closely connected, because efforts have been part of repression and supported by Iran, but we have the situation in Syria as well. And we talked about the need for supporting evolution, and we're at a moment where it's not exactly evolutionary, it's quite violent. Last week, France, Spain, and the UK all came out in support of the Syrian National Coalition, which is a kind of loose coalition of resistance forces to the Assad regime. Is that the kind of, is that a good example of the kind of appropriate measure in support of evolution? It seems to me maybe that's the kind of evolution that may soon be leading to armed engagement part of the West.
Yeah, the problem that you've got is this, and you can actually see this very clearly from Iraq, in fact, is that once you remove the dictatorship, and okay, there's nothing more brutal than the Saddam dictatorship, but the fact is once you remove it, out comes religious, ethnic, tribal, and other factions that then make it very hard to stabilize the situation. And really what you've got in Syria is a very similar development in the sense that, and I choose my words carefully since one of the things you learn about the modern world is that life is on the record. You see, most people are now in the situation of saying, we want Assad to go. There's got to be a new dispensation in Syria. And the hesitation Western policymakers have got, and which is why they are edging towards intervention rather than going wholeheartedly for it, is, yes, but if you get rid of Assad, what then happens? And the Syrian national opposition are a collection of different groups. They've now been welded together into something more united. But even so, you know, if you were to predict the future of Syria over the next 10 years, you'd find it pretty hard to do. So the problem really is we are faced with a situation where what you want to do in Syria is agree some form of evolution, right? Assad says, okay, I will go, but we'll have an evolutionary process that changes the constitution, ends up with the people being able to elect their government. And yet you've got, at the present time, what is effectively a kind of civil war, in which, by the way, and this is also a feature of this region now, you have proxies from the outside, inside the country, proxies for outside powers. So Syria is no longer a place where it's just a question of the internal Syrian opposition fighting the Syrian government. You've got huge amounts of outside money, weapons, and all the rest of it coming into this battlefield. So disentangling it is going to be very difficult. Now, personally, I think in the end, you know, with almost 40,000 people have died in Syria already, if this continues, I think the pressure for the West to ramp up its intervention will increase. But truthfully, if it were possible to get some sort of international consensus that had Russia and China in agreement with the US and Europe, that would be infinitely preferable. I'm just not sure it is possible.
The question